Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? Today, we're going to be looking at something that hits close to home for a lot of Australians, especially after the last few years: flood mitigation. We're diving into a PhD thesis that looked at how homeowners in flood-prone areas of Southeast Queensland perceive those risks and how that shapes, their decisions about protecting their homes.
Yeah, this research is really interesting because it tackles, pretty significant knowledge gap. The Australian government, as you know, they have this whole shared responsibility thing when it comes to disasters like floods.
Right. So they expect people to sort of take charge, right? Be responsible for their own flood risk.
Exactly. But there hasn't been much research into how that actually works in practice. Like, how do people actually respond to that expectation?
I mean, it's kind of like assuming that just by, giving people information about flood risk, they'll automatically know what to do and actually take action.
Yeah, and that's a big assumption, right? And this thesis really pushes back against that idea. It gets into, all the complexities of risk perception, how people make decisions, and it reveals that there's often a disconnect between what the government expects and how people actually behave.
So how did this PhD student go about untangling that disconnect? What was their approach?
They used a really cool mix of methods, combined quantitative data like surveys and statistical analysis with qualitative data from interviews and, actually going out into the field and observing things.
So it's a mixed methods approach.
Yeah.
Makes sense, right? The numbers tell you what's happening, but the stories behind those numbers, well, those can help explain why.
Exactly. Like, think of it as, I don't know, the difference between looking at a map and actually going for a hike in that area. You get a much richer understanding.
Totally. And speaking of maps, this research was done in Southeast Queensland, an area that's, pretty familiar with floods, unfortunately.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And the student focused on homeowners in a range of flood risk zones from like high to low, which helps, make sure the findings are relevant to the different experiences people have in those flood prone areas.
And I think it's worth mentioning, this PhD student wasn't just working in isolation. They had some pretty heavy hitters advising them, some of the top experts in flood risk management.
Oh, absolutely. Really strong team behind this research, which gives you a good sense of its, credibility. It's built on a solid foundation.
Yeah, it's not just, some random project. And speaking of solid foundations, to make sure the data was strong, they had a good sample size, right?
Yeah, they ended up with 479 completed surveys. Pretty impressive for a PhD study, and it means we can be more confident in the reliability of the findings.
So we've got a relevant topic, strong research design, good sample size, credible experts. Sounds like a good recipe for some insightful findings.
Yeah. Oh, it definitely is. Now, to really dig into how people make those decisions about flood mitigation, the researcher used a couple of key theoretical frameworks: protection motivation theory, or PMT for short, and ecological rationality.
All right, those sound a bit academic. So break it down for us. What are these theories all about, and how do they inform the research?
Sure. So PMT, it basically helps explain why people decide to do things to protect themselves. It looks at two main things: threat appraisal and coping appraisal. Threat appraisal is how you perceive the threat itself. How bad is it? How likely is it to happen to me? Coping appraisal, on the other hand, is about your assessment of the things you could do to protect yourself. Like, how effective are they? How possible are they for me to actually do?
So it's not just knowing there's a risk. It's about weighing that risk against, the effort and the payoff of doing something about it.
Precisely. And this connects to ecological rationality, which suggests that people make decisions based on their surroundings and their experiences. So for floods, that means things like past experiences with floods, what's normal in their community, even like the physical characteristics of their house and where it is.
So our decisions aren't just based on, pure logic. They're shaped by all these different factors, right? Both internal and external.
Right. And by using these frameworks, the researcher could look at the data in a way that considers all those complexities. It's about understanding how people make sense of flood risk and how that drives their decisions.
So how did the researcher actually use those theories? What kind of questions did they ask in, the surveys and interviews?
Well, with the protection motivation theory, they wanted to see how people perceived the threat of flooding. Did they think it was serious, or did they, downplay it? They also wanted to know how homeowners felt about different ways to mitigate floods, like raising their homes, insurance, even moving. Did they see those things as effective? Did they feel like they could actually, do those things?
It's starting to sound like flood mitigation is about a lot more than, just building higher walls and sending out alerts. It's about understanding those individual decisions and how people actually make choices when facing risk.
Absolutely. And that's where this thesis gets really fascinating. It dives into the nuances of those choices and how they're influenced by, threat appraisal, coping appraisal, and the homeowner's ecological rationality. We'll get into some of those specific choices like house raising, insurance, and even relocation in the next part of our deep dive. But for now, let's take a quick break and we'll be right back with more insights from this groundbreaking research.
Stay tuned, folks. There's a lot more to unpack.
Yeah, you got it. This thesis really gets into those choices people make and how those choices are shaped by, like you said, threat appraisal, coping appraisal, and ecological rationality.
Okay, so let's get into those choices. The thesis looked at house raising, flood insurance, and relocation, right? What did the research say about how people approach those options?
Okay, well, let's start with house raising. You might think that would be like the most popular choice, for people who see flooding as a big threat.
Yeah, makes sense, right? Worried about flooding.
Yeah.
Lift your house up.
Well, it turns out it's not that simple. The research found that it wasn't that straightforward.
Oh, really? Why not?
Well, remember, it's not just about seeing the threat, it's also about coping appraisals. The research actually found that homeowners who had experienced some flooding but with minimal damage, they were less likely to raise their homes.
Huh. That's interesting. Why would experiencing a flood, even a small one, make someone less likely to do something like that? It seems counterintuitive.
It goes back to that idea of ecological rationality. If you've already gone through a flood and your house is okay, you might think, well, my house is strong. It can handle some water. Maybe I don't need to go through all the hassle and expense of raising it.
Right, right. So it's like that experience, even though it wasn't that bad, gives them a false sense of security.
Exactly. And it also ties into something called optimistic bias, where people tend to underestimate their own risk. They might think, flooding's a problem, sure, but it won't happen to me again.
So past experiences can really influence people's decisions, even if those experiences don't really reflect the real risk, huh?
Absolutely. And, with house raising, there's also the coping appraisal side to think about. Raising a house is a huge thing. It's expensive, it disrupts your life, and there's a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, it's not something you just decide to do one day, right? There's permits, builders, maybe even having to move out while the work is being done.
Exactly. And the research showed that these practical things played a big part in people's decisions. Even if they knew about the flood risk, the cost and complexity of raising their home could be too much. The perceived benefits just didn't outweigh the perceived costs.
Right, like a cost-benefit analysis, but with a really personal and, potentially emotional decision.
Exactly. And this was especially true for people who were older or had a fixed income. They might not have the money to even consider it.
So it's not just about knowing the risk, it's also about having the means to do something about it. Makes you think.
It does. And here's another thing about house raising that came up in the research. People who had experienced flooding from creeks or overland flow, so not just rivers, were more likely to think about raising their homes.
Now, that's really interesting. You'd think people who live near a big river would be the most worried about flooding.
Right. You would. But again, it comes back to those personal experiences and ecological rationality. If you've been flooded from a source you didn't think was a big risk, it can really shake you up. You might start to think, well, if my house can flood from a creek, what's going to happen when the river floods?
It's like your ideas about risk get totally turned upside down by something unexpected.
Right. And it shows that just relying on official flood maps isn't enough. They're important, sure, but they don't always show the whole picture.
They might show a low risk of river flooding, but not include the possibility of flash flooding from smaller waterways or heavy rain.
Exactly. And those experiences of being caught off guard can really affect how people make decisions.
Okay, so we've talked about house raising. Let's move on to flood insurance. What did the research tell us about how people thought about insurance?
Okay, so this sort of gets really interesting. The study found that 90% of homeowners had flood insurance.
Wow, 90%. That's a lot. I'd have thought that more people would be hesitant about insurance, especially with all this talk about risk and costs and benefits.
I know, right? And here's the thing. A lot of those homeowners, even those with insurance, they didn't actually think it was a very good way to protect themselves from flooding. They complained about insurance companies, policies that were hard to understand, trouble getting their claims paid, all sorts of stuff.
So if so many people aren't happy with flood insurance, why do they have it? It doesn't seem to make sense.
That's the big question. And the thesis suggests a few reasons why. One is that even though it's not perfect, insurance gives people a feeling of, like, peace of mind.
It's that better to have it and not need it kind of thing.
Exactly. But in this case, it seems like a lot of people are wondering if they actually need it at all. Another interesting finding was that people with kids under 12 were more likely to have insurance.
That makes sense. Having kids makes you think more about risks and wanting to protect your family.
Yeah, it's about that feeling of responsibility, but there's also that optimistic bias we talked about earlier.
Oh, okay. How does that fit in with insurance?
Well, the research found that people who had a flood before, but with not much damage, were more likely to have insurance. It's kind of like that experience, instead of scaring them, made them feel more secure and more likely to depend on insurance.
So it's like they think, I've been through a flood and it wasn't that bad, so insurance will definitely cover me if it happens again.
Precisely. And this shows just how complicated these decisions really are. It's not just logic. It's emotions, past experiences, personal situations. It's all mixed up.
All right, so we've talked about house raising and flood insurance. Now let's talk about relocation. What did the thesis find out about how willing people were to move away from flood-prone areas?
This is where those ideas of protection motivation theory and ecological rationality really come together. Relocation wasn't just about how much flood risk there was, it was about how people felt about that risk.
So it's not just about living in a high-risk zone. It's about how much that risk worries you,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, and the strongest predictor of whether someone would think about relocating was actually worry. People who were really worried about flooding were much more likely to consider moving, even if their risk wasn't that high.
Makes sense. Some people can live with that constant worry, but for others, it's just too much.
Right, and this is where ecological rationality comes in again. People's past experiences, their social networks, how attached they are to their community, their financial situation. It all plays a role in how they feel and whether they're willing to relocate.
So for some people, leaving might be the only way to get away from that worry, even if it means starting over somewhere new.
Exactly. And the research also found some differences between men and women when it came to relocation. Men were more likely to say they'd be willing to move than women.
Really? Do we know why that might be?
That's a good question, and the thesis doesn't really go into detail about why there might be those gender differences, but it definitely raises some interesting questions for more research. It would be fascinating to find out how, cultural expectations and how people cope with risk might be playing a role.
It just shows that there's always more to learn, even with a detailed study like this one. But even without all the answers, this research has given us some really valuable insights into how homeowners in flood-prone areas make these difficult decisions.
It really has, and one of the most important things to remember is that there's no single solution for flood mitigation. What works for one person might not work for another. It's about understanding individual situations, the psychology behind those decisions, and the bigger picture of their environment.
So it's not about telling people what to do. It's about giving them the power to make their own choices based on their own needs and how they see things.
Exactly, and I think that's where this research is especially important for policymakers and people working in flood risk management. It gives them a more complete and accurate understanding of how people behave when facing flood risks, which can help them develop better strategies for mitigation.
It's about going beyond those simple assumptions about human behavior and realizing that it's actually much more complex.
Absolutely. And that's where we'll pick things up in the last part of our deep dive. We'll talk about some of the bigger implications of this research and what it means for creating communities that are more resilient to floods.
We've covered so much ground already, talking about this PhD thesis and how homeowners in flood-prone areas are dealing with tough decisions like house raising, insurance, even relocating.
Yeah, it's really fascinating stuff, isn't it? And like we've been saying, there's no magic bullet, no single solution that's going to work for everyone.
Right, and we've talked about that gap, between what the government expects with their shared responsibility idea and how people actually make decisions. So what can we do to close that gap? How can we, work together to make flood mitigation more effective?
That's the big question. And this thesis gives us some really good ideas. The first thing is, we got to realize that just telling people to be prepared isn't enough. Not everyone understands flood risk the same way or has the same resources to do something about it.
Yeah, it's like you can't expect everyone to, I don't know, climb a mountain just because you tell them the view is great.
Exactly. We need to focus on those things that make people more vulnerable and affect their decisions, like maybe offer financial help for people who need to raise their homes but can't afford it.
So shared responsibility has to work both ways, right? The government needs to provide support and resources.
Exactly. And we need to get creative about how we talk about flood risk. in a way that connects with people. Remember how we talked about those personal stories and how powerful they can be?
Yeah, those stories really stick with you. It's not just about throwing numbers and technical terms at people.
Right. Imagine using those stories in public campaigns, community workshops, even those brochures they send out about flood preparedness. It could make a real difference.
Meeting people where they are, listening to their concerns and helping them make those decisions without feeling overwhelmed.
Exactly. And insurance companies could do more too, right? Like offer discounts for people who take steps to lower their flood risk.
That's a great idea. It encourages people to be proactive, and it benefits both the homeowner and the insurance company.
Exactly. Align those incentives so people are motivated to make those smart choices early on.
So financial assistance, better communication, and incentives through insurance, all good ideas.
Yeah.
What else can we do to make communities stronger and more resilient to floods?
I think one of the most important things is to build that sense of community ownership, where everyone feels like they have a part to play. It can't just be the government telling people what to do. It has to come from within the community too.
Yeah, so residents taking charge of their own resilience, finding solutions that work for their specific needs and challenges.
Exactly. Think about neighbors working together, developing their own flood plans, sharing knowledge, and helping each other through those tough choices.
That shared responsibility, right? It's not just about individual homeowners, it's about the whole community.
And that's where this research is so valuable. It shows that we need a more holistic approach to flood mitigation, one that considers the social, psychological, and ecological aspects of risk.
It's about going beyond those simple assumptions
Yeah.
and recognizing that human behavior is complex. People don't always make decisions based on logic alone.
Absolutely. This thesis isn't just about presenting findings. It's about making us think differently and finding new ways to build safer, stronger, and more resilient communities. Because ultimately, that's what we all want, right?
Yeah, it's a good reminder that true resilience goes beyond just physical things. It's about strong social connections, a deep understanding of the issues, and a willingness to work together to face those challenges.
And that's maybe the most important takeaway from this research. It's a call to action for all of us to rethink how we deal with floods and create a future where communities can thrive even when facing risks.
So, to our listeners, we ask you, what role can you play in building that future? How can you use what we've talked about today to make a difference in your own community? Support your neighbors, make informed choices, and keep asking those important questions. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into flood mitigation. Keep learning, keep exploring, and until next time, stay curious.